E.J. McMahon from the Empire Center, thanks so much for being here on New York Now with your perspective this week.
You're welcome.
So, EJ, we have a financial crisis with the state right now. There's a lot going on. The governor is saying that the federal government needs to give the state billions of dollars, or else he's going to be forced to cut funding to, and he says, schools, local governments, and hospitals. And I think for a lot of people watching the show and reading the news, they're wondering why the governor's going there out of everything else in the state. And you were one of the top economic analysts in the state. So I'll pose this question to you that I know everybody's thinking. Is there anywhere else that the governor could go for to make up this funding, I guess, that he's lacking? Or is it right for him to really focus in on local government, schools, and hospitals?
Well, no, there's nowhere else you can go. The bulk of the budget is in the form of what's classified as local assistance. And in fact, the biggest single chunk of the state budget, over 25% of the state operating funds budget, is school aid. So that is always number one, especially because if you need to save money, especially because school aid is the category of state spending that is most easily and directly controlled by the governor and by the legislature. If you reduce school aid, you can immediately reduce your cash flow. The second biggest, roughly tied with school aid in terms of its share of the total state-funded operating budget, is Medicaid. But the Medicaid program is extremely complicated, has a lot of moving parts, and at its core is a social services entitlement as well. And so it's difficult to quickly wring big bucks out of Medicaid, which has been further complicated by the fact that the governor had a significant Medicaid cost overrun going on before the pandemic crisis, and he's in the process of not completely solving that problem. So he's going to have to make major cuts to the state budget sooner or later. How soon is a function of how much money he gets in the next federal stimulus bill from Washington.
So there's this conflict right now, as our viewers know, between the governor and Republicans in the U.S. Senate about that money, which would fund state and local governments, essentially. And Mitch McConnell, the U.S. Senate Majority Leader, has called this a blue state bailout at one point. And the governor's kind of hit back on that, saying, this isn't a partisan issue. But I think McConnell's point was that New York in the past may have mismanaged its finances in a way that put itself in a deficit even before this, like you mentioned. So
Right.
When we're looking at this situation, is it, McConnell says blue state bailout. The governor says you're going partisan about it. Which is it, EJ? Is it something that we should look at from a partisan perspective, where the state may have been mismanaging its money, or is this funding really needed to help the state through this time?
Well, first of all, of course it's partisan. Everything is partisan. When the governor says it shouldn't be partisan, he's being partisan. McConnell is posturing. There's no way the Republican U.S. Senate is going to do, for instance, the massive, almost immeasurably huge giveaway that was in the bill the House Democrats passed last week, which, by their own account, would have given New York State and its local government something like $65 billion, more than half of it for the state, on the basis of which Cuomo might be actually making a profit on the deal. What is going to happen, though, I think that aside from the posturing and the politics, at some point in the next few weeks, probably sometime in June, as the governor has now recently acknowledged, you can expect the Senate and the House to cut a deal, and there will be another round of unrestricted federal aid, the first fully unrestricted federal aid for states and local governments. I'd be willing to even go out on a limb and predict that what New York State gets will probably be in the neighborhood of what the governor actually needs to balance his budget this year only, which would be in the neighborhood of $7-8 billion. Not the sums he's talking about, which are inflated from multi-year levels. But that's only a stopgap. He's got a multi-year problem. Basically now the economy overnight virtually has been knocked to a much lower level of performance than the level of the state spending trend before the pandemic.
Right. The comptroller said, just going back to where the state economy is, the comptroller said, I think it was either late last week or early this week, that New York is right now seeing, and I'm quoting from him, economic devastation not seen since the Great Depression. Looking at all the figures that we have right now, I know obviously it's only been 2 months of this COVID crisis. Is that a fair characterization of what we're going through right now and maybe where we're headed in the next few months?
Absolutely, that's a fair characterization. I think his description hits the nail on the head. The comptroller is correct. This is by far the most serious economic and financial situation problem that the state of New York and its local governments have ever faced. In fact, you can compare economically the situation to the Great Depression. Maybe it won't turn out to be that bad, but during the Great Depression, government operated on nothing even close to the scale it now has. So this is a totally different situation now, and this is certainly by far the worst economic downturn, the most sudden, the most severe, and the deepest that anyone has experienced in the last 2 lifetimes. And state government and local governments have never had to cope with anything like this. And there's a limit even to the ability of the federal government just to provide wave after wave of aid. At a certain point, we're coming to crunch time, and there has to be a reckoning, as I said. And I think that there's going to be some very tough decisions have to be made, and some very significant decisions about reining in spending and restructuring government across the board.
All right, well, we will keep an eye on it here on New York Now. E.J. McMahon from the Empire Center, thanks so much for joining us here on New York Now this week. We always appreciate your perspective, making these numbers make sense to our viewers.
Thank you very much, Dan.